All right, hi everybody. Today or tonight, whenever you're watching this, I would like to talk to you about designing a nature reserve. And we'll start with some variables, and many of these you should be familiar with already based on other things we have talked about and discussed. So on the left, we have a scenario that is considered worse, and on the right, we have things that are better. So at the very top, an ecosystem that is completely protected, for example, is generally better than an ecosystem that's only partially protected. And you would already know that a small reserve would be worse than a large reserve, which is under the better heading, as you can see there. But in some of these cases, what's on the worst column, you could argue, might be better than what's on the better column. There's discussion later on where we can sort of hash that out and talk about that, but there are scenarios where you might find this is not entirely accurate, and so we'll discuss those a little bit. So considerations when designing your nature reserve. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that ecosystems are subject to disturbances. If you go out to any particular ecosystem on a Wednesday, for example, if everything's perfect, nice weather, all that kind of stuff, you might look at that and it might be a perfect scenario. Unfortunately, nature is always changing, and sometimes changing in unpredictable ways. And that's one of the more significantly difficult things to do, is to design your nature reserve based not only on the perfect scenario in a perfect day. Can you predict what will happen with certain disturbances, for example? So once again, disturbances in small reserves tend to be more problematic than disturbances in large reserves. Now, the problem is, if you look at the distribution of reserves throughout the world, over 96% of the nature reserves in the world are small reserves. Less than 4 are greater than 10,000 square kilometers, which would be considered a large reserve. The Grand Teton Yellowstone ecosystem, that area in Yellowstone National Park, would be considered a large reserve, but we don't have very many of those in the continental United States. If you live in Southern California, you probably already know about fire being a significant problem and a huge problem today. And these fires are increasing in severity in many places, including Southern California, you could argue. And that's partially due to climate change. And another scenario, particularly in places like California, and in addition to climate change, you might remember Smokey the Bear. Well, when I was a kid, Smokey the Bear, we were sort of taught by Smokey the Bear that fires are bad and we should always put out fires. Well, it turns out that was somewhat part of the problem, because in Southern California and other climates like Southern California, you can't simply escape fires. And so what is a better management practice that we use now are doing things like controlled burns to relieve sort of some of that pressure of that fuel load building up. So you might remember the summer of 2013, we had a really big giant fire called the Rim Fire, and that entered Yosemite National Park and a lot of the Forest Service lands outside the park, and it caused significant damage and was a huge problem. So these massive wildfires burn basically uncontrollable, and you basically have to wait for the weather to change and for the fire to somewhat burn itself out. And fires, of course, don't happen only in Southern California, although that's where we hear about them quite often. You might remember right as the pandemic started, it was a particularly bad time in January of 2020, all kinds of things. Not only did the pandemic start, but Australia had a huge wildfire that was a giant problem, in part in a place called Kangaroo Island, pictured here, where the red arrow is pointing to. and right off the coast of Australia. And this big bushfire almost burned basically about half of Kangaroo Island down, and had a huge impact on wildlife, including koala bears. And that's, of course, what probably made the news so much over here in the United States, because we like koala bears, and everyone probably should. But anyway, some koala bears managed to survive. Lots of them didn't survive. Koala bears are not a fast moving, tolerant species, if you will. So they don't do well escaping from fires, for one. And the second part is that there are some that survived the fire, but then there was nothing left for them to eat in that area because many of the trees had been burned down. This is a picture of Kangaroo Island in that area where the burn was. On the left is before the burn, on the right is after the burn. You can see this drastic difference in the vegetation, so that not only is the fire bad, but it also removes the food. So you end up losing, in this particular case, the photosynthetic organisms that make up that base of your energy pyramid. And another example, insect outbreaks. And so this particular beetle, this is called a mountain pine beetle, pictured here. Not a very big insect. It's a native insect in this particular area, but in this particular case is a native insect. But due to climate change, the conditions are getting drier, and this mountain pine beetle is spreading and is attacking more trees. And these white bark pines, the tree, they are a keystone species. You might remember that a keystone species is one in which happens to be quite important for lots of other organisms in an ecosystem. So if you lose that keystone species, you often lose lots of things connected to it. In this particular case, these pine trees are very important for grizzly bears because they eat the seeds from the pine cones right before they hibernate. And this allows them to sort of load up on fat. And with warmer climates, this is leading to bark beetles attack, impacting the population, in this case, of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Floods can be another thing that impact reserves, particularly small reserves. And you might remember we talked about this tiger reserve in India. So the park sits on a floodplain, and there's a major river running through the park that regularly floods. Now, in part, this river happens to be very, very important for the park and for the tigers that live there, because that, in fact, when the river's functioning normally, that extra water brings in a lot of wildlife, and that's why it's a significant feature in a tiger reserve. It actually is beneficial. However, there are times when you have these big monsoon seasons and these floods, and this river floods, and it ends up kind of wiping out the border of your park. The other issue is you have a lot of private land out there that's being developed into tea farms and things of that sort. And so what ends up happening is you have this conflict because you have flooding that occurs, which displaces animals. And then right outside the park, you have development occurring. Displaced animals don't interact too well with this new development, and it ends up causing trouble. So in this picture, you can see this is a National Geographic map of the tiger reserve. You can see the river right here. Well, right outside the reserve is a road, Highway 37 here, that leads into the outskirts along the edge of the tiger reserve. And once again, even though it's outside the reserve, in conditions where you have flooding, animals get displaced outside the flood area, and then they're likely to start showing up in areas where you have people, and that ends up not being such a good thing. So here's some images of that flood from 2016 in July. So here's one of these rhinos here trying to escape the flood. You can see already the rib cage of the rhino. So this is a rhino's having difficulty finding food anyway. And the flood just, of course, makes things much more difficult. So a couple other things you have to consider when designing a reserve. There's biological considerations, such as having wildlife corridors. Those are important. We've talked about corridors before, but remember, corridors allow you to connect to maybe small reserves, which helps in it making it more like a bigger reserve. So corridors are a useful way to connect smaller ecosystems. It also helps minimize disease. Higher populations give you more diversity. And we also have issues with invasive species. Those are animals that are not supposed to be there, or plants that are not supposed to be there, that sometimes sort of take off. So an example, so we're building this corridor over Highway 101 that will connect to ecosystems and possibly save local mountain lions from dying out, because again, mountain lions are at the top of that energy pyramid, and so they need a lot of room just to have just a few of them because of the pyramid of biomass. That's $87 million of your taxpayer dollars going to that. And you might think that that's a huge number, $87 million. I'd like to point out that in the United States, we spend something like $3 billion on Halloween costumes. All right, another problem is invasive species. Florida happens to have a tremendous number of invasive species, in part because a lot of the reptiles, like this Burmese python, for example, and other similar animals in the pet trade, tend to be tropical animals. Florida, lots of places in Florida happen to be a tropical environment. And so when people get pets that they can no longer keep, sometimes we call these disposable pets, because they don't know what to do with their pet, and instead of sending it to, giving it to a wildlife refuge or that kind of thing, they just let it go. Now, in Southern California, letting a Burmese python go or an alligator go or that type of thing, they usually aren't going to live very long because it gets kind of cold and they won't do well trying to hibernate in that scenario. So that usually is the end of it. But in places like Florida, many of these tropical dwelling animals have done, unfortunately, very well. So, for example, in this Burmese python, they found this endangered key largo rat in the stomach. And so that's one of the examples of what an invasive species can do. And I've shown you this picture before of the tiger reserve on the left, and then on the right-hand side, on the other side of the fence, is the buffer zone. Well, people in India that are not in the reserve, but they're sort of in the buffer zone, they're allowed to use that space to do things like collect wood and also graze their cattle and things of that sort. Well, occasionally what happens is tigers don't know necessarily that they're in the reserve or not, and occasionally they'll leave the reserve and kill someone's cattle, and that makes the people that live there very upset. And so many of these places have to have some kind of economy in place where the government or whoever runs your nature reserve is willing to pay the people when they lose cattle and that sort of thing. So one thing you also have to deal with is considerations that deal with economic or political matters. And that can be a huge issue. As an example, in the Southwest United States, there's lots of public lands in the United States which are areas set aside for ordinary people to go recreate and enjoy nature. So that's what public lands are set aside for. Well, sometimes in those public land areas, there's oil or gas or other minerals of some sort. And so there's a bit of a conflict because there's potentially money to be made. All right, so for example, in 2016, President Barack Obama created the area known as Bears Ears National Monument. And a national monument is kind of like a natural park. So in a national monument, there are certain activities you can't do, like drill for oil and gas and things of that sort. So that ends up being a bit problematic sometimes. So just 11 months later, when President Trump was elected, he basically reduced the size of Bears Ears National Monument by 85%. And in fact, that's the first time that I know of in the history of the United States that a monument was created by one president and reduced in size by another president. And in that particular case, it was set up or it was reduced in size in part to allow for more areas to be opened up for oil and gas development. Now, you could argue perhaps that oil and gas are financially very, very important, and therefore it was worth it. But once again, as far as this course goes, you've taken an area that would have been, a larger reserve, and when you reduce it by 85%, you now have a much, much, much smaller reserve in that scenario. But just as an example there, that's one of the types of things that happens in areas that potentially have a great deal of financial reward on them. Okay, so we'll stop there and we'll talk to you all later.